you from home in Launceston, Tasmania. And joining me in presenting today are members of our NIA SIG on mental health. So Helen is joining us from Newcastle, and Helen is actually the facilitator of the special interest group this year, which I just wanted to mention. And Marguerite is on the Sunshine Coast, and Juliet is joining us from Western Sydney. So before we start today, I just want to mention that the NIA has several SIGs, several special interest groups that members are very welcome to join. And we actually started our particular special interest group on mental health back in 2015. And it's become a really lovely community of colleagues, academic and professional staff, and we pretty much meet and just share whatever challenges we have, bounce ideas around, all about supporting students and staff. Our SIG members include people who have teaching roles, lecturing and tutoring in enabling education. So Marguerite and I fit into that category. We also have counsellors in the group. So for example, Helen is a counsellor for students in enabling education at the University of Newcastle. And in Juliet's Pathways program at Western Sydney Uni, she's the manager of retention and progression. So it's really nice to have a mix in our group. We bring different experiences and perspectives to our meetings. And just one more thing before we start. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint later on. I can send a PDF to Praneet that can go on the website with the recording. So let me see, I'm just going to move on to our plan for today. So here you can see our plan. We're going to break the session up into 6 parts. To start with, it's important to name up what we actually mean by mental wellbeing. Then section 2, we'll look at our context and challenges in order to set ourselves up to spend time on section 3, which is how we can actually support our mental wellbeing. So in section 2 and section 3 will form most of the presentation, and it's really been informed by conference papers that we've done together as a SIG over the years, as well as our discussions that we've had over several years. So the references are at the end, but the 2 main papers that will come up a fair bit, one that's called Emotional Labour Demands, and 6 of us from across the country worked on that a few years ago for the 2017 NIA conference. And another one I'll refer to a bit is by Anita Olds, led by Anita Olds, a member of our SIG from Murdoch Uni. So that was in preparation for the FABENS conference in New Zealand in 2018. And that one looks at debriefing. So in thinking about what we're actually going to do today, the 4 of us, Helen, Marguerite, Juliet and I, met and discussed ideas from these papers, but we also sort of stopped to think about, well, to what extent can we use the strategies in the current context? So we really want to share those observations with you, and that will form part 4. And there'll be time for questions at the end, and we'd really like to hear from you. You might be doing different things or have made some other observations, so it would be great to hear from you later on. And as Praneet mentioned, you can do that via the chat function, but he'll also help us out later to turn your mics back on if you'd like to share that way. So on to our first part, defining mental wellbeing. It's actually really difficult to pin down terms like mental health and mental wellbeing, because they have different roots in medicine and philosophy, and they get used really differently in different disciplines and in different contexts. So for the purposes of our presentation, we're using a definition that I've used for my recent report with the National Centre. And so basically I've underpinned it with multiple conceptualizations. It's underpinned by multiple conceptualizations of wellbeing. And you can see at the top there, adapted from the World Health Organization, we're going to understand mental wellbeing as being about being able to manage the normal stresses of life, the normal stresses of uni and work and life, about being able to be productive, fulfilled and have a meaningful life. So I've used a combo of, as I said, these multiple conceptualizations, and you see the combination model in the diagram there, and which really is a combination of psychological needs, belonging, purpose, agency and growth. And this combination model draws on the work of Bake et al. That's from a great project, an OLT project, the Uni Student Wellbeing Project. and also from Woodyard. So they're both drawing upon, or their work is informed by Ryan and Detchi's self-determination theory, but using that in the higher ed context. So on to section 2, to our context and our challenges in enabling education. For people, for a fair few people in the audience, I'd say this, if you work in enabling education, this won't be news to you, but for people who are outside enabling education, we just wanted to provide some context for you. So due to the nature and purpose of our courses, our students often arrive in our courses having had a variety of past educational experiences. They come from a variety of backgrounds, say backgrounds that are areas that are underrepresented in higher ed. They might come from sort of the designated equity groups in Australia, which include groups like low socioeconomic status backgrounds, regional and remote, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, students from non-English speaking backgrounds, which includes students from refugee backgrounds. Students are also often first in family and mature age. And as noted here on the slide, students might arrive with diagnosed mental health conditions or learning challenges, all that they all impact on their learning. Or they might experience mental health difficulties that aren't actually diagnosed, but they nevertheless impact on their learning. And during a semester, they might be fluctuating, different at different times of the semester. So by the nature of our work, the programs, the student cohorts, we do find ourselves supporting students' academic and non-academic challenges. You often can't split the two, one impacts on the other. We have a variety of experiences. Our work can be challenging and it can also be deeply rewarding. It can, and it does, impact on our mental well-being. And as individuals, we have different coping strategies. And as small communities, say within our own enabling education programs or across the country, we have different ways of dealing with the challenges together. I want to add that we're not in an isolated context within enabling education. We operate in our larger institutions. And so that means that there's some things we have agency over and some things we just don't. So Helen will talk a bit more about that later in our reflections section. So this diagram here, it shows the main themes from our paper, Emotional Labour Demands, and we broke up into the challenges that we experience, so the emotional labour demands and this role we call the gatekeeper role. And we also found, put some other themes into the category protective factors. So one protective factor being a community of care and support, and another being witnessing our students' transformations. So now in this section 2, we're going to spend some time unpacking these challenges and our experiences, and we'll do this by breaking it up into these 3 parts. So what I'll do now is hand over to Marguerite, who will unpack the first 2. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Nicole. Victor, thank you very much. So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. The quotes on this and the next 2 slides are drawn from the reflective paper that Nicole mentioned in her introduction that 6 members from the Mental Health Special Interest Group collaborated on. All 6 of us represented different universities with different structural approaches to our enabling programs. I think that it's important to bring awareness to this, as we are a microcosm of colleagues who go some way in representing the macrocosm of enabling educators in general. However, at the end of this presentation, as Nicole mentioned, we'll be opening the floor to discussion, and we're certainly eager to hear what your experiences and thoughts are around this topic. Okay. So by way of definition and explanation, emotional work is a term used to describe the effort made to understand and empathise with others and their situation. We see this lived out in actions such as taking time to listen to student concerns, offering advice, and demonstrating genuine care and our positive regard for our students, both on an individual and also on a collective level. Emotional work becomes emotional labour, which is a term that was originally coined by Ali Hochschild, when it requires the regulation of emotional expressions and feelings, such as when educators have to induce, neutralise, or inhibit their emotions, rendering them appropriate for the situation. So basically, emotional labour is what employees perform when they're required to feel, or at least project the appearance of feeling, certain emotions. And a simple way of thinking of this is imagining, or a situation with a retail assistant, for example, dealing with a difficult customer, but still displaying a very cheery, happy demeanour. So as you can see in the bottom quote on this slide, the educator describes holding on to her shock. And here she's regulating that emotional response to be able to then walk back into the classroom with her game face on. Here she's managing her emotions, that is neutralizing them, to be able to continue her work, discussing paraphrasing. I think you can all probably go some way to imagining the effort and energy that it took to hold and sustain those emotions during the period of a tutorial, or possibly even beyond the tutorial, given the information that's been disclosed there in the quote. So what this quote represents are the moments, and I'm pretty confident that all the enabling educators in this webinar have examples of these moments where we've had to instantaneously acknowledge, regulate, and then manage our innate emotional responses. This actually takes a significant amount of intra and interpersonal intelligence or awareness to manage and then regulate, and then in turn make a conscious decision, as the quote indicates, on displaying the appropriate professional emotional response. And then in this case, the response is to the student, while simultaneously taking into consideration the context, the relationships, and of course the others who might be present in that environment. Effective teaching is all about authentic relationships, and so we engage in emotional labour to connect with our students. Ultimately, our performance of emotional labour is related to our professional and philosophical stance around the role of caring in our teaching and learning. Thanks, Nicole. All right. So emotional labour can drain our emotional resources, which can lead to detrimental psychological and physical health outcomes, including conditions such as burnout. Burnout may include emotional exhaustion, cynicism and distancing, as well as a reduced efficacy and sense of personal accomplishment. Later in this presentation, Helen shares some more detailed information about burnout and some very useful coping strategies to avoid and manage it. Burnout is worst case scenario of emotional labour, and one that we really hope our presentation and ensuing conversation afterwards can go some way in offering mitigation. We need to point out that emotional labour is not necessarily all attached to our work with students. In fact, our emotional interactions with our students may well be our protective factors. More detrimental emotional labour might actually be involved in interactions with colleagues, university systems and structures, as Nicole mentioned, and broader political agendas, for example, the ones that we're experiencing nationally at the moment. The good news is, though, as the bottom two dot points indicate, emotional labour is not all bad. Thanks, Nicole. Okay. So the positives of emotional labour are represented on this slide in the diversity of feelings that we experience. Enabling educators are no strangers to the positive feelings associated with the successes of and interactions with our students. Our special interest group research and hallway and conference conversations with colleagues are testimony to the fact that much emotional labour gives rise to the meaning that we gain out of the work that we do. Get a group of enabling educators together and you'll hear plenty of stories, and I know there's plenty of you in the audience that I've shared and had the honour of hearing your stories, that share the privilege and the satisfaction of bearing witness to the student transformation that we're privy to. I'll even go out on a limb here and suggest that most of you possibly do what you do, not so much as loyalty to the institution, but because of the difference that it makes to individual lives and therefore our greater society. This in itself requires emotional labour, as can be seen in the seesawing of emotions and related feelings that are exhibited on this slide. This can be a bit of a workout for our limbic and thus endocrine systems. So after Nicole discusses the next slide, Juliet, Nicole and Helen talk about some diverse approaches to self-care. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Nicole again.
Thanks, Marguerite. So this next one is interesting that we've found hard to articulate. So I might just read the bit at the quote at the top there. This role is unique as the alternative pathway experience is the threshold, the gate through which a student must pass if he or she is to be considered fit for university education. So we're sort of calling it this an ill ease, a feeling of ill ease, because on the one hand, we have this allegiance with our students. We're in it with them. We want them to do well. We're doing everything that we can to help them develop the academic literacies and skills that they need to make a smooth transition to an undergrad course. But at the same time, we're probably marking their work, and in some cases, failing them. And failing them thinking, well, this is the right thing to do because they're not ready for that next step. So, and we don't want to be setting them up to fail in an undergrad course and in incurring debt. So it's this really kind of weird position to be in. And as it's pointed there in one of the dot points, it's a complex and contradictory role. So it's something that in the paper we called it teacher as gatekeeper, but in chatting about it last week, we changed it to staff to include academic and professional staff, because it's not just teaching staff who have this experience. Helen noted that her role as a counsellor for students in enabling education, she has experiences a similar ill ease. So that brings us to the end of section 2, and I'll now hand you over to Juliet, who will introduce section 3.
Thanks, Nicole. As educators, it's important to think about supporting and continuously nurturing our mental well-being. So the next part of the webinar is looking at a number of ways that we can support our own mental well-being. We will be looking at each of the following areas in a little more detail over the next couple of slides. The importance of community, a community of care, and how you can foster it. Debriefing to develop psychological capital, bearing witness to students' transformations, and diverse coping strategies and self-care. I'll be taking you through the first area, which is the importance of community.
Seems like Juliet has frozen for some reason. Juliet, can you hear us?
Really relevant now during the COVID-19.
Juliet, you froze. Would you like to start talking about the importance of community again?
Looks like she might have dropped out, Nicole.
Okay, well, how about we move on to, we'll save that slide for Juliet for when she returns, and we'll move on to the next slide. You can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. So we'll move on and come back to Juliet's in as soon as we can. So what I'm going to talk about Sorry, just finding my place. All right, so what I'll do is move to develop psychological capital. So when we drill down into the theme of coping strategies, which is going to be covered in detail shortly, one of them is debriefing. So we were interested in exploring this further, and that resulted in a paper that Anita Olds led. And basically, we're just interested in finding out what it is to debrief and what the benefits are. So as enabling educators, it's not something that we do formally. You know, in some professions, it's factored into people's into their working weeks. It's not for teaching staff, but we found that we do it, or we can do it informally, particularly with like-minded colleagues that you trust and have a rapport with. So by debriefing, what we mean by that is talking, venting, sharing, and this talking and venting and sharing really leads to us reflecting on our situation. And it's an opportunity to converse, to connect, and then that leads to us to build relationships and to problem solve. Something else that happens is that it helps us to validate the experiences that we're going through. And another thing that happens is that it helps us to distribute the emotional load. So we're not feeling like we're carrying that emotional load alone. We might be sharing it with our colleagues in our enabling program. So in the paper, we argued that debriefing can help to reduce symptoms of burnout, and that it can help to build what's referred to as psychological capital, which has 4 pillars of self-efficacy, resilience, hope, and optimism. So is Juliet back yet? Or maybe not. I'll keep going along, and we'll just keep in mind that we'll go back to Juliet's when she returns.
I'm trying to get in touch with her, Nicole.
Okay, fantastic. Yep. So something else that we found useful in our 2018 reflective piece is the positive impact on us as educators of actually seeing the transformations that students go through. So I'll just read this statement out here. Whilst the emotional labour load is heavy in enabling space, witnessing and being part of students' transformations enables a more effective carrying of the emotional load. So that's, you know, seeing students' developments and transformations. It might be through their enabling program, but also later on throughout their degree. So, for example, you might get an email from a student telling you that, you know, in their semester 1 of their first year in their undergrad course, they got a distinction for their first essay, or you might bump into them in the cafe on campus and hear how they're going in their degree, or they might send you an email to tell you that they're graduating. So it's just following that trajectory. We noted can have a real positive impact on us. So now I'll hand over to Helen for the next part of section 3.
Thanks for that, Nicole. So in thinking about these ways that we support our mental wellbeing as enabling educators and enabling practitioners, we thought it was really important to think about the ways that we do cope, and some of those ways being both reactive and proactive were described by some of our colleagues. So our negative labour demands and stress impacts all of us differently, and we all have different ways of coping. Sometimes these ways of coping, though, can actually be a sign that we're feeling an unhelpful level of stress. And if we don't manage our stress effectively, or we rely on unhelpful ways of coping, we might start to notice some of those signs of burnout creeping in, which Margaret alluded to earlier. So burnout is defined as a state of chronic emotional, physical, and mental fatigue, and it's often caused by excessive and prolonged periods of stress in our lives. So some signs of burnout can include taking frequent sick days or presenteeism, constant feelings of exhaustion besides even though we're getting enough sleep, cynicism, being careless, making mistakes we wouldn't usually make, feeling like our work is pointless, or not being able to be motivated to do our work and not meeting deadlines. We might also notice impact in our personal life with not being able to concentrate on things that we'd normally enjoy doing, like watching a film or a movie or reading a book. So it's really important that we find our own way to cope and to balance things in order to maintain our mental well-being. as we discussed earlier when we were defining mental well-being, it's being able to manage normal stresses of life, and that includes uni life, and to be productive and fulfilled and have a meaningful life. And so that requirement that we have of students to manage the normal stresses of uni is as much appropriate for us as staff as it is for us students. So just next slide, thanks Nicole. So thinking about these different ways of coping, it's important to think about how we can actually develop our own strategies to prevent stress. So we can recognise and act when we see those signs creeping into our life, and if we experience them, take them seriously and deal with them. And this can prevent things from getting worse. It's also important to look at our commitments, and if we're feeling overwhelmed, assess what we have on our plate and assess the demands on our time and see if there's anything that we can get rid of. Can we let anything go? It's really important at this point not to drop the self-care activities we might be engaging in that are a part of our routine, and I'll talk about these a bit more in a moment. It's also important to ask for help and let someone know if you're feeling overwhelmed. This can help us decrease our stress and stop that feeling increasing. It may mean that we need to be assertive about our needs and how we're coping, but we know that assertive communication is a really effective and efficient and beneficial style of communication. It allows us to take care of ourselves, and it's fundamental for good mental well-being and mental health. It's also important, again, when we're thinking about commitments, to set reasonable goals. If we're setting unrealistic goals and piling on more and more work commitments, or expecting that we always have to be successful when we try new things, that can be, a bit of a recipe for stress. So thinking about ways to assess the expectations we have of ourselves and whether they're reasonable. Would we have the same expectations for a friend or a colleague? And again, thinking about if this is a bit of a theme, you might want to look into getting some support around the role that's maintaining your stress cycle. Time management and effectively managing our time and deadlines can really help us keep on track with our stress. If we feel like we have a plan, then we can see a record of what we're planning to do and what we're going to do, and it can take away some of that stress. It also allows us to record what we've achieved and see it. So if we're, having those feelings that we're not achieving anything, we actually have a record that we are getting there. Self-compassion is really important to think about when we talk to ourselves. When we feel stressed, we might notice that our self-talk can become quite harsh and unhelpful, and even critical of ourselves and how we're coping. So again, thinking about those expectations that we have on ourselves. If we set really high standards, then we might hold ourselves accountable if we're not coping. This kind of cycle then perpetuates our stress. We have another reason to feel stressed and like we're not coping. So self-compassion is very much like showing compassion to yourself in the same way that you would show it to somebody else, perhaps a valued friend or a small child, and think about what you would say to them, and practice saying these things to yourself. Sometimes we think self-criticism is a way that we can improve our performance, but it's often unhelpful in the long term because it activates that threat pathway in our brain, and it can lead to further worry, stress, decrease our mood, and it also makes us participate in coping strategies that are unhelpful in the long term. Lastly, making time for self-care. This one's really important, so it's actually got its own slide, and it's something that we spoke to our colleagues about. Thanks, Nicole. So we might get into a bit of a thinking trap and feel like we're spending time on ourselves is a waste of time, and that we have too many things on our to-do list. We might feel like there's too much to do, and this can lead to feelings of guilt when we're taking time for ourselves. But this me time, this downtime, is really essential to our mental and physical well-being. These breaks will actually increase our productivity and keep our stress levels down and reduce burnout as well. It's important to bear in mind that self-care activities should give you a break from your work and leave you feeling refreshed and relaxed. This could include taking a short break to have a coffee in the sun, or going for a short walk, perhaps catching up with a friend, going for a drive, going for a walk, even just looking at something that you find beautiful or engaging in an activity. It's important to bear in mind that things though like watching TV or, you know, getting lost on the internet, they generally don't relieve stress. It generally lets it sit dormant and is a bit of an avoidance strategy. It's really much more effective to engage in activities that are calming, such as meditation, yoga, walking, and physical activities such as sport. These activities will release positive endorphins and help us with our sleep as well. Sleep is also really important. So thinking about making time to have a look at your sleep and your diet, seeing if you're eating a balanced diet. In addition to scheduling fun activities, we need to take care of those things as well. So just before I head over to the next slide, where we talk about the reflections on supporting staff mental wellbeing, I'm just going to hand back to Juliet because I can see that she's popped back into the webinar. So if we want to maybe head back to her slide and then we can pick up where we left off.
Thank you. Sorry. And look, in talking about stress, I certainly felt quite stressed when I, you know, just when I'm about to talk to a slide, my Zoom just suddenly decides to play havoc. So I do apologise for that, everyone. So just from where I dropped off, so we should never underestimate the importance of community to our mental wellbeing, as it really provides us opportunities to support one another, interact, share experiences, our modern day life struggles, and particularly relevant now during the COVID-19 pandemic. At Western Sydney University, the college, we have established a teacher wellbeing community of practice, and our shared understanding is that teacher wellbeing is just as important as student wellbeing. Our community of practice is ever so important in the current landscape as we continue to reach out to each other while working remotely. People generally appreciate when we show genuine care and interest, and providing that social support can be just as rewarding as receiving it. Other ways to build community and institute an institute of culture and care could be as simple as walking meetings, or as one of our dear special interest group colleague likes to call it, ice cream walks. And they literally eat ice cream as they talk and connect. One of our learning and teaching teams at the college have themed weekly Zoom meetings called Wine Appreciation Meeting, and another Where's Wally, both creating a space to connect with teachers and to really to provide that support and genuine care. So how will you build and foster a community, a culture and a philosophy of care? So I'll leave you with this thought to ponder while we progress into the next couple of slides. Am I handing over to Helen, or is it to Nicole? I've just, yeah.
Thanks for that, Juliet. Yeah, so I mean, and I think that reflection and that space for reflection is one of the things that is really important. So thinking about making space for that in your life, and that's certainly something that we've had the opportunity to do while preparing for this webinar, and also through our discussions as a SIG. So we've also reflected on a lot of the issues that have come about from working as enabling practitioners during the pandemic. We found that there have been some challenges. For example, the debriefing that we would normally do to support our mental wellbeing is no longer a casual 30 seconds grabbed with a colleague in the hall, and so we don't have that opportunity to just casually check in. Another thing that we've found that's a challenge is that boundaries have become quite blurred. Sometimes the move to the online learning has really prompted that, and also working from home. So with our online activity, such as our social media accounts, they might be doorways that are suddenly open to students into our private life and our personal life. And also our online availability can suddenly be viewed as 24/7, not just by students, also by colleagues and sometimes by management as well. So again, that working from home has been a challenge. It doesn't allow us to separate our professional and our personal identity. There have been some strategies though that we've found that are helpful. And also, thinking about those things and how we can look after ourselves. So flexibility is certainly one of those things, and continuing to engage in those value-led coping strategies and self-care ways that we've protected our emotional demands. So for example, doing yoga online, or finding a time to go for a walk rather than going to the beach or the gym. And also being mindful of the discomfort that might be showing up around some of the things that we are experiencing, and not necessarily putting those off through avoidance behaviours. So for example, setting limits around online news or social media, or if we're binge watching Netflix, so noticing some of our thinking that's coming up and why we're engaging in those behaviours. It's really important to notice your thinking around these things. That, even doing sessions like coming along today, often we'll have that experience of having a thought that we don't have time to do these things, and yet they're really important. I know for myself, some colleagues in counselling and I made a 30-minute morning tea time to catch up every day during the working from home situation, and I was really conscious of my thinking that was coming up around not having time to do that and being too busy. And so it was about acknowledging that and making space for those thoughts and what was coming up for me, but still engaging in that really valued behaviour and allowing myself that opportunity to have those casual conversations and debrief in that way with my colleagues. There's been some opportunities though that have come from the working from home and from the online learning and all of the different things that we've encountered. We've found some of those opportunities, within this SIG, where we've created this space to reflect on broader issues. We don't just see them as our own issues anymore, but as broader issues that are impacting us all. It's important to reflect and validate those experiences with your colleagues. We've also had that increased opportunity to reflect on our work and why we do what I do, some of those things that Nicole spoke about. And it's really important for us to be able to share our work identity outside of the workplace as well. So that's been an opportunity through this time, as friends and family have been able to get a little glimpse into what we do and perhaps why we do it. We've learnt a lot from our students and colleagues during this time. It's created a space where it's levelled out across the university, and we're working in a space where suddenly we can be engaged in an online chat with senior management at the university. So it's broken down some of those barriers and it's shown humanity across those levels. It's also helped us students see our flaws as we struggle in this new online learning space, and we're suddenly expected to respond in new and often very uncomfortable ways as we do things. So as enabling students, it's really, really helpful for them to see that we're engaged in that online learning and that ongoing learning. It normalises our responses, no matter that they're stressful, and it's a real world opportunity for them to see us engaged in growth. In terms of what we'd like to see post-COVID, I generally would really like to see a respect for space and difference continuing. We don't know if we're there yet, but I can be hopeful, and to see that there's no black and white, there's no right way of doing things and responding to things, and that we're all learning and doing this, and to be curious about that. And perhaps this is something that you might like to think about and reflect on with us at the end. If there is some learnings that you'd like to take, into post-COVID land. In terms of those observations, though, that we've had, we have found some general things that have come across for us as a group, and thanks, Nicole, for that. So those reflections have given space for observation, and again, thinking about whether you've noticed any of these things or your colleagues have spoken to you about anything. So again, we've noticed that gap between staff and students has lessened. You know, we might not all be in this together, but to some extent the reality is that we are having this shared experience. And so that shared experience and the similar stresses that we're experiencing across managing work, study, children, caring, the power in the space has become less clear. Compassion and patience and self-compassion, mental wellbeing has become suddenly embedded in a lot of what we're doing as practitioners, and certainly for my educator colleagues that's been the case. And so for me as a practitioner, that's been a fantastic opportunity for that to come to the forefront. And we know that embedding any kind of learning is best practice, and certainly embedding mental wellbeing into curriculum and into the explicit learning that's happening is really important. It's also important to see that, you know, we need to continue to support ourselves and acknowledge the context that we're in. So it's not normal to be in a pandemic, and so we don't really know how to do this. We've not done this before, and there's a lot of room for uncertainty. So continually validating that for ourselves and our students can be really helpful, because it is normal, in spite of the fact that it's not normal to be here, to feel stressed. So there is a lot of uncertainty in this really extraordinary time. It's important to be kind to ourselves and to each other, and there's lots of opportunities within the space to create that connection. And again, to alter our expectations of both ourselves and our students. This might not look the same as it did when we started the year or with what we're used to, but that doesn't mean that it's not a good space to create those opportunities. And again, as Nicole alluded to earlier and Marguerite mentioned as well, we are in this broader context of change across universities at the moment. So remembering that that does also increase and add to those emotional labour demands. Thanks, Nicole.
Great, thanks everybody. So just to recap over our presentation, we've defined the term mental wellbeing, identified and explained the emotional labour demands of our work in enabling education, shared some practice-based proactive and reactive strategies of mitigating stress, offered some practical information on monitoring your own wellbeing and useful coping strategies to do so. And finally, we've acknowledged that our work and everyday lives are situated in that broader societal context, which this year in particular has proven to be collectively challenging. So now what we'd like to do is open the floor to questions and discussion, and to kickstart that, we have a couple of questions on the next slide. That's not to limit our conversation, but just to get us started, because we thought that these would be topical at the moment.
So thanks. What I've done is actually I've now enabled you to be able to unmute yourself. So if you would like to answer or comment, you are able to unmute yourself and turn your videos on as well.
And maybe we should stop sharing the screen, do you think?
It's up to you. Yeah, it's probably a good idea. Yeah. So if you'd like to comment or ask a question, you can either type it in the chat or you can turn on your microphone and ask questions that way too.
So one of the questions that I've just put into the chat is if there's any strategies that you'd like to share with us that you might have used at your own institutions or for yourself personally in relation to those stresses and emotional labour demands that we've mentioned. We'd be really keen to hear from any of you.
I think Karen Siri was putting her hand up. There we go.
Oh, actually, Pranita, I was resting my hand.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I will make a comment though. Lovely, and thank you for the presentation. It was really fabulous. I think at the university I represent, CQ University, one of the things that's really stood out for me is how much a cohesive team, when you've got a cohesive team, how much they value their interactions with each other. And what has been occurring across our many campuses are campus teams are doing Zoom sessions just you know, come on in if you've got half an hour. And that has worked really well. I've occasionally managed to pop on in, and they've been having some good laughs and sharing. So that's one thing that I think's worked well.
I might respond to that because I just, the same, we were doing the same thing at our university. So last semester we were entirely online, and we had a regular meetup. This semester we're on campus and online, and so we're not having those regular meetups, and you can really feel the space and the gap of that. So those regular meetings, and I know Helen spoke about it as well, definitely just to touch base and share some stories, particularly about our interesting experiences with Zoom. And what for us, because we've always been entirely face-to-face university, now what that online experience is like as well.
Absolutely, and that was something we spoke about as well, because I mentioned when we were working from home, we were having these regular online catch-ups with my colleagues in counselling. And as an embedded practitioner, I don't sit with my counselling colleagues, I sit separately from them. And so it actually created a space where I could have that casual debriefing, which I don't usually get in my day-to-day role here as a counsellor. And so since we've come back to the office, because we're back on campus at Newcastle, I don't have those casual opportunities so much anymore, unless I go over to where my colleagues are located, and then they're often with clients or doing things. And so it's actually been that absence of the online connection there that's been happening as well. I can see we've had Teresa sharing a strategy that she's had at her institution, where they've had some leadership meetings, starting with absolutely going around and asking for some positive things or some challenging things, and checking in before the formal meeting starts. That's a great one to share, Teresa. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? You don't need to be shy. We're a pretty friendly bunch. So if you do have any questions for us.
Well, in addition to if there's any other strategies that you found that have worked, there were a couple of questions we asked on that slide about reflections. So if there's anything you'd like to add to that, so what would you like to keep from this current period when we're out through the other end? Or say the other question was about what have you learnt from students and staff? I might just jump in and answer my own questions to start with, but I've really enjoyed opportunities such as this. I think there've just been so many opportunities to see what's going on at other universities, and there's so many webinars going on that formerly we'd have to fly somewhere and be at a conference or miss out. So I find, say, there's things going on in Hobart that normally I wouldn't get to go to because I live in Launceston, but I can just attend from my home. So those opportunities have been fabulous. Something I was thinking that I hope we can all learn through this experience is what it's like for a lot of our students. So I'm thinking about mature age students who juggle their work, their studies, their children, and in this period of time as educators, many people have been experiencing that as well. So that, I think, gives us more of an insight into what is normal for our students outside of the COVID period. So
thanks, Nicole. It's Susie here from
fabulous. Go for it, Susie.
Yeah, I'll go for it. I really liked some of the things that you had to say, especially about self-compassion and the way we talk to ourselves. I think that's really important. Some of the things that I have learned, or some of the things that I really have enjoyed about working from home, I guess, is, first of all, I have kind of like a morning routine. So just to set up my day, so I do my, some practices, and then I have my walk, and I sit in my happy place and just tune into myself and do my affirmations and all of that kind of thing. So I've actually got time to do that instead of driving into work. So that's kind of a positive. I think it's very important working from home to make sure that you know, you get up and you instead of walking to the fridge, you might walk around the block or do something positive like that. And I think it's also very important to make sure that, you know, you don't do all these extra hours, because it's really easy to have the computer there and just keep having another look, and, you know, so you've got to sort of be able to turn off, I think, and just stick to the hours that you've got. Because that's really important, I think, having boundaries around my time, because otherwise I'd end up just spending my whole time working, and it actually takes me longer to do everything. I'm much better off sticking to a time frame and then just getting done what I need to do and then moving on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Susie. Would anyone else like to jump in? We've got a few minutes left. And I might just share the screen again, just so you can get our contact details if you'd like to get in touch about the SIG or about anything to do with today's presentation. But please do jump in.
And we've got a few people on the chat who are sharing as well, which is fantastic. A lot of people saying that there was an increased demand on their cognitive load, especially in semester 1, as we were learning all these new ways of doing with online learning, and also, you know, the challenges that Zoom presents. And you got to experience some of those firsthand with Juliet today, as our mind and our brain struggles to overcome these challenges instantly in a moment, and also when things aren't working right and we're trying to build new connections. I think it's really important to acknowledge it does take a toll on us emotionally and physically and mentally. And so it's really validating to see a lot of our colleagues that are experiencing the same things.
There's also Victoria's initiated a conversation there that a few people have picked up on, around, you know, sort of developing the difficulties of developing a relational space using Zoom. And that's definitely, I'd love to hear from more experienced online educators around how they have managed to do that in the past, because I know that I've been very reliant on the classroom and the actual space. And I know that there's a couple of people that are responding to Victoria as well. So if there's anyone out there in Zoom land who knows, who's been using, working in the online space for a while, and if you've got any hints around that, that would be pretty cool.
Okay, I think just looking at the time, it's probably a good time to sort of try and wrap it up, unless somebody has a very quick comment to add just before we sort of wrap up. I think one of the things that's coming out loud and clear is the opportunity for us as educators to connect with each other. And as you mentioned at the beginning of your slide, Nicole, I think as educators, but particularly as enabling educators, we are so invested in our student success that quite often we tend to neglect our own well-being, and therefore sometimes that can have a flow-on effect on our students as well. So it is important to sort of look after ourselves as well. You know, we are all in this journey together with our students. So it was very, very refreshing and really great to hear from all the research that this particular SIG does. So thank you very much for that. And thank you also to everyone who joined us today. If you want to know more about the SIG or the National Association of Enabling Educators, just Google us and go to our website and find out about the contact details of the mental health and well-being SIG, but also other special interest groups that NIA supports. So on that note, I think we'll probably wrap it up. And once again, thank you very much for all the presenters and all the attendees for today.
Thanks for organising, Pranit.
Thanks, Pranit. Thanks.
No worries.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Yes, and the slides will be
Thanks,
available. I
everybody.
think, Praneet, you're going to send those around, or people can contact, we'll make it live, the
Yes.
recording.
Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned that. It will be shared via our National Association of Enabling Educators website and Twitter.
Yep, thanks.
Yep.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Julia and Marguerite. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Praneet.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Has Helen disappeared?
Seems like it. Let me just stop the recording.